The night was cold and still, the kind of cold that settles into old bones and refuses to leave. It was 11:47 on a Thursday evening in November when the silver Toyota Camry pulled quietly into the driveway of 14 Heron's Crest Lane, a modest house on the edge of Dunmore Falls, a small town in rural Pennsylvania where nothing much ever happened. The porch light was off. The front curtains were drawn tight. Inside, a man named Ellsworth Calder, 83 years old, a widower, a veteran, and a deeply frightened man pressed himself against the living room wall and peered through a gap in the curtains at the car idling in his driveway. His arthritic hand was wrapped around a loaded .38 revolver that he had kept in his bedside drawer for 11 years. He had never fired it at anything living. That was about to change. Yet his breathing was shallow, his eyes were wide. In his mind, everything about this moment confirmed his worst fear. A stranger had come to rob him. A stranger had come to take everything he had left. The man in the car was 29 years old. His name was Tomas Guerrero. He had dark eyes, a quiet smile, and a faded green jacket that his mother had bought him 3 Christmases ago. He was a rideshare driver, had been for 2 years working the late shift to save enough money to move his younger sister into a better apartment on the north side of the city. He had driven 41 rides that week. This was supposed to be his 42nd. The app on his phone showed the correct address, 14 Heron's Crest Lane. He had followed every turn the GPS gave him. He had done everything right. He sat in the car now, waiting. And as drivers are trained to do 2 minutes at the pickup location before sending a message, he typed, "I'm outside, whenever you're ready." He was calm. He had no reason not to be. He had no idea that a man on the other side of that curtain had already decided he was dangerous. Ellsworth's granddaughter, Petra, had made the booking. She was 24 and lived 3 states away in Columbus, Ohio. She had set up the rideshare app on her grandfather's phone 2 weeks earlier so he could get to his cardiology appointment the next morning without driving himself. She had prepaid the ride, set the pickup time, and sent him 3 voice messages explaining exactly what would happen. A driver would arrive. The app would show a name and a car. All Grandpa had to do was walk outside. But Petra did not know, could not have known that her grandfather had spent the past month falling deeper into a spiral of fear. He had seen 3 news segments about phone scams targeting the elderly. He had received 2 suspicious calls that week that had rattled him badly. He had stopped opening his front door after dark. When his phone buzzed at 11:45 with an alert saying, "Your driver Tomas is arriving," Ellsworth did not read it as a service notification. He read it as proof that someone had hacked his phone. Someone knew his address. And now they were outside. He moved to the door. His slippers scraped softly on the hardwood floor. The revolver was heavy in his hand, heavier than he remembered. He unlocked the deadbolt but did not open the door yet. He stood there listening. He heard the car engine. He heard a door open. Tomas had stepped out, deciding to walk to the porch since no one had come out after 2 minutes. He heard footsteps on the gravel path. He heard a knock, soft and polite, 3 times. "Hello? Your ride is here." Ellsworth's heart was slamming against his ribs. The voice was young, male, unknown. In his mind, that meant threat. That meant danger. That meant the moment he had been dreading was finally here. He did not call out. He did not look through the peephole. He did not wait. He opened the door and fired once. The sound of the gunshot split the quiet night like an axe through wood. Tomas Guerrero dropped on the porch steps without making a sound. The bullet had entered his chest on the left side. He lay on his back looking up at the cold November sky, his green jacket spreading dark with blood. Ellsworth stood in the doorway, the revolver still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. For 3 full seconds he did not move. Then he looked down at the young man on his steps, and something in his mind cracked open. Not guilt yet, not understanding yet, just a terrible, hollow shock. He stepped back inside. He picked up his phone. He dialed 911. His voice, when the operator answered, was barely a whisper. "I think I shot somebody," he said. "I think I made a mistake." By the time the ambulance arrived, Tomas Guerrero was gone. He had bled out on the porch steps of a stranger's house, 40 miles from his sister, with his phone still glowing in his jacket pocket, showing the words, "Ride in progress." To understand what happened on that porch, you first had to understand Ellsworth Calder. Not the man who pulled the trigger, but the man he had been before. Fear swallowed him whole. Ellsworth was born in 1941 in Dunmore Falls, the second of 4 boys raised by a coal miner and a school teacher. He grew up in a house where the front door was never locked and neighbors walked in without knocking. He played baseball on the gravel lot behind the Methodist church. He caught fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings. He knew everyone on his street by name and everyone knew him. The town was small and slow and everyone understood everyone else's business, and that was just fine with Ellsworth. It was the kind of childhood that leaves a man with a deep belief that the world is fundamentally decent, that people mostly mean well, and that bad things, when they happen somewhere else. He carried that belief for most of his life, and it served him well, until it didn't. He served 2 years in the Army in the early 1960s, came home, married a woman named Dorothea Marsh, and spent the next 4 decades working as a machinist at the Hensley tool plant outside of town. He and Dorothea raised 2 children, a son named Gerald who moved to Portland, and a daughter named Shirley who died of cancer at 41, leaving behind a baby girl named Petra. When Dorothea passed away from a stroke in 2017, Ellsworth found himself alone in the house they had shared for 51 years. He had never lived alone before. Not once in his entire life. He did not know how to cook more than 4 things. He did not know how the thermostat worked. He did not know how to navigate the loneliness that arrived each evening like a cold draft under the door. Yet he was 76 years old and completely lost, though he would never have said so to anyone. Men of his generation did not speak about being lost. They fixed things. They endured. They got on. For the first 2 years after Dorothea died, Ellsworth managed. He ate simple meals. He kept the house clean. His neighbor Beaumont Yates checked on him twice a week, and sometimes they watched baseball together on Ellsworth's old television. Gerald called every Sunday. Petra drove up twice a year and stayed for a weekend. It was a quiet life, but it was functional. Then the calls started. The first one came on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 3 years after Dorothea's passing. A man with a smooth, confident voice told Ellsworth that his Medicare account had been flagged for suspicious activity, and he needed to verify his information immediately or his benefits would be suspended. Ellsworth knew better. He had heard about these scams, and he hung up. But the call had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. It felt so real. The man had known his name. Over the following weeks, more calls came. Some were robotic voices. Some were real people. One caller claimed to be from his bank. Another said his grandson had been arrested and needed bail money wired immediately. Ellsworth had no grandson, so he recognized that one quickly. But each call left a residue of anxiety that did not fully wash away. He started watching news segments about elder fraud. He learned that scammers sometimes sent people to victims' homes to collect cash payments. He learned that some scammers worked in coordinated teams, one calling the target while another approached in person. He wrote these facts down in a small notebook and read them back to himself at night. What had begun as reasonable caution was slowly transforming into something darker. The world outside his window, once so familiar and friendly, was starting to look like a stage set for something terrible. He started closing the curtains before sunset. He started checking the lock on the front door 4 times before bed. He started sleeping with the revolver on his nightstand instead of in the drawer. No one noticed how far he had slipped. Gerald was busy in Portland. Petra called regularly, but the calls were short and cheerful because Ellsworth always said he was fine. Beaumont had moved to a retirement facility in March. The house on Heron's Crest Lane, once full of Dorothea's voice and the smell of her cooking, had become a fortress of one. An old man and his fears, sealed inside together, with no one to interrupt the conversation. When Petra booked the ride share for his cardiology appointment, she was trying to take care of him. She had no idea that the gesture she meant as love would become the fuse of a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had no idea that by the time the silver Toyota Camry turned into her grandfather's driveway, Ellsworth Calder had already decided, in the quiet siege of his own mind, that a stranger arriving unannounced after dark could only mean one thing. Tomas Guerrero was not supposed to be driving that night. He had planned to take Thursday evenings off. Yet it was the one night he reserved for calling his mother in Guadalajara and watching whatever game was on with his roommate Desmond. But 3 days before his death, his sister Valentina had called him crying. Her landlord had raised the rent by $300 and given her 30 days to come up with the difference or vacate. Valentina was a certified nursing assistant working double shifts at a long-term care facility. She had a 4-year-old son named Marco. She was doing everything right and still barely keeping her head above water. Tomas had listened to her cry and said the only thing he ever said when the people he loved were struggling. He said, "I'll figure it out." And then he hung up and opened the rideshare app and switched his availability to 7 days a week. That was the kind of man Tomas Guerrero was. Not complicated, not dramatic, just steady, reliable, and quietly devoted to the people who depended on him. He had grown up in Harrisburg, the oldest of 3 children born to Ernesto and Claudia Guerrero, who had come to Pennsylvania from Mexico in 1990 with $200 and a shared conviction that their children would have the life they never had. Ernesto worked construction. Claudia cleaned offices downtown. They taught their children 3 things above all: work hard, stay humble, and take care of each other. Tomas had absorbed these lessons completely. He graduated high school with a 3.4 GPA, earned a community college certificate in logistics, and spent his early 20s bouncing between warehouse jobs and delivery routes. He was good at all of them because he showed up on time, did not complain, and treated everyone, and supervisors, co-workers, strangers with the same easy, unassuming respect. He had no criminal record. He had never been in a fight. His most notable quality, according to everyone who knew him, was his patience. Tomas never got rattled, his roommate Desmond would later tell investigators. He was the most calm person I've ever known. He had been driving for the rideshare company for 2 years when he died. His rating was 4.97 out of 5, near perfect. He had completed over 3,000 rides. Passengers left him reviews that all said variations of the same thing: safe driver, kind, no unnecessary conversation, made me feel comfortable. He kept his car clean. He kept mints in the center console. He kept a phone charger coiled neatly on the back seat armrest. He was professional in every sense of the word. On the night he died, yet he had been on shift for 6 hours. He had completed 9 rides. He had stopped for gas and a coffee at a Sheetz station on Route 11 at 11:15, and the cashier, a teenager named Briley, had chatted with him for a few minutes about the cold snap coming in. He was in a good mood, Briley told police the following morning. He was laughing about something. He said he was almost done for the night. The ride request from 14 Heron's Crest Lane came through at 11:41. The app listed the passenger as E. Calder. The pickup was in Dunmore Falls, about 12 minutes from where Tomas was driving. The destination was Dunmore Falls General Medical Center, a hospital. He accepted the ride immediately. He had driven dozens of people to hospitals. He knew how to be quiet and steady when people were scared or sick. He turned the radio off, as was his habit for medical pickups, and followed the GPS through the dark country roads toward the address. He was thinking about Valentina, probably. About Marco. About how many more rides he would need to cover the $300. He was thinking about ordinary things, the small, human mathematics of a man trying to hold his family together. He was not afraid. There was nothing in his world that night to be afraid of. He was just a man doing his job, on his way to a house he had never seen, to help a stranger he had never met. He would never know that the stranger had already decided to kill him. When Tomas pulled into the driveway and the app showed no movement from the passenger, he waited the standard 2 minutes. Then he sent the text. Then he stepped out of the car. West because he was thoughtful and thorough, because it was cold and he figured the passenger might be elderly or unsteady. He buttoned his jacket, the green one from his mother, and walked up the gravel path in the dark, toward the porch. He knocked 3 times, politely, the way you knock on the door of someone's home when you're a guest. He called out, "Hello? Your ride is here." His voice was calm. His hands were empty. His face, if Ellsworth had looked through the peephole, would have shown nothing more threatening than a young man doing his job on a cold Thursday night. But Ellsworth did not look through the peephole, and Tomas never got to say another word. Petra Calder was asleep when the call came in at 12:43 in the morning. She was a social worker in Columbus, Ohio, exhausted from a difficult week of home visits and court documentation. She had set 2 alarms, one for 6 and one for 6:15, and had fallen asleep on her couch with a half-read book on her chest. Her phone lit up on the coffee table. The number was her grandfather's. She answered it on the second ring, because she always answered her grandfather's calls no matter the hour. His voice, when she heard it, made her sit up immediately. It was flat, scraped hollow, like something human had been removed from it, and only the mechanical parts were still operating. He said her name once. Then he said, "Something happened. Something bad." Petra was on her feet before he finished the sentence, her book falling to the floor, her mind already reaching ahead of his words, trying to understand what she was about to be told. She said, "Grandpa, what happened? Are you okay?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I shot a man, Petey. I shot the driver you sent." The drive from Columbus to Dunmore Falls took just over 5 hours. Petra made it in 4.5. She drove the entire way in a state that was not quite crying and not quite calm, somewhere in between, a suspended place where her hands gripped the steering wheel and her mind ran the same loop over and over. He didn't know, he didn't know, he didn't know. She had spoken to the Dunmore Falls police dispatcher during one of her stops. She had been told that Ellsworth was in custody, that a young man was dead, and that an investigation was underway. She had been told not to speak to the media, who were already gathering outside the police station. She had called her Uncle Gerald and listened to him cry in a way she had never heard a grown man cry before. She had called her own supervisor to say she would not be in on Friday. She had done all of this efficiently, mechanically, because she was a social worker and she was trained to function under pressure. But inside, she was being dismantled, because she had made the booking. She had set the pickup time. She had been the one to put Tomas Guerrero in her grandfather's driveway. What Petra did not know, what no one in the family had known, was how far Ellsworth's fear had progressed. She had known he was lonely. She had known he watched too much news. She had noticed, on her last visit in August, that he had become more cautious than usual, checking the door lock twice when they left for dinner, so flinching slightly at a car that backfired on the street. But she had attributed it to age, to widower's anxiety, to the ordinary wariness of an old man living alone. She had not known about the notebook. She had not known about the revolver on the nightstand. She had not known that her grandfather had spent the last several weeks in a private war against an enemy that existed largely in his own mind. If she had known, she told investigators later, voice breaking, if she had known any of it, she would have driven up herself. She would have taken him to the appointment. She would never, never have sent a stranger to that door after dark. When Petra arrived at the Dunmore Falls police station at 6 in the morning, the sun was barely up. 2 news vans were parked across the street. A detective named Orla Stem met her in the lobby. As a compact, serious woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a coffee cup in her hand. Detective Stem shook Petra's hand and guided her to a small room with fluorescent lighting and a table with 4 chairs. She told Petra, calmly and clearly, what the investigation had established so far. Ellsworth had fired once through the open doorway. The bullet had struck Tomas in the chest. He had died on the porch. The 911 call had come in at 11:52. The responding officers had found Ellsworth sitting in his recliner, with the revolver on the floor beside him, still in his slippers. He had not tried to run. He had not tried to hide. He had just sat down and waited to be found, like a man who understood, in the marrow of his bones, that what he had done could not be undone. As Petra listened to all of this without speaking. When Detective Stem finished, Petra pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling and said, "He thought he was protecting himself." Detective Stem said, "Yes." And then she said, "That doesn't change what happened to that young man." The Guerrero family was notified at 12:30 that morning. Claudia Guerrero, Tomas's mother, collapsed in her kitchen in Harrisburg when the officers told her. Valentina, who had been asleep with Marco curled against her, answered her door to find 2 police officers with their hats in their hands, and she knew before they spoke. She had called Tomas at 11:30 that night just to check in, the way she always did on his late shifts, and he had not answered, which was unusual, and she had told herself he was just busy. And standing in her doorway at 12:40 in the morning, she understood now that he had not answered because he was already gone. The 4-year-old boy she would have to raise now without his uncle. The man who had always said, "I'll figure it out." He had been on his way to figure out her rent. He had been on his way to take care of her. And now, he was never coming home. Detective Orla Stem had been with the Dunmore Falls Police Department for 19 years. She had worked robberies, domestics, a hit and run that had taken her 2 years to close. She had never worked a case quite like this. The facts were not in dispute. Ellsworth Calder had shot and killed Tomas Guerrero on the porch of his own home. The gun was registered to Ellsworth. The 911 call was his voice. The bullet that killed Tomas had come from Ellsworth's revolver. Plus, there was no question of who had pulled the trigger. The question, the one that would come to define the entire case, was what was inside Ellsworth Calder's mind when he did it. Was it murder? Was it a terrible mistake made by a frightened old man suffering from cognitive deterioration? Was it both? These were not simple questions, and Orla Stem was not a woman who settled for simple answers. She put on her glasses, poured a second coffee, and began to build the picture, piece by piece, the way she always did. She started with the crime scene. Forensics confirmed what the initial response had suggested. Tomas had been standing on the second porch step when he was shot. He had not been attempting to force entry. The door had been opened from the inside by Ellsworth. The shot was fired at close range, less than 6 feet. Tomas's phone was still in his jacket pocket, the rideshare app open, showing the ride in progress. There was no weapon on Tomas's body or in his car. There were no signs of a struggle. The gravel path showed only one set of footprints approaching the porch Tomas's and a drag pattern where officers had carefully moved his body. The porch light had been off, which Stem noted in her file with a small asterisk. Had the light been on, Ellsworth might have seen Tomas's face more clearly, might have seen the green jacket, might have read the body language of a man simply doing his job. The darkness, she wrote, had served the fear. She interviewed Ellsworth on Friday morning, 24 hours after the shooting. He was seated in the same small room where she had met Petra, but without the coffee, without the reading glasses, without anything to soften the fluorescent severity of the space. Ellsworth looked, Orla thought, like a man who had already sentenced himself. He was upright in his chair, his hands folded on the table, his jaw set. He was wearing a gray cardigan over a white shirt, the clothes he had been allowed to change into after processing. He answered every question in a low, careful voice. He did not ask for a lawyer at first, though one was subsequently appointed. He told Orla exactly what had happened. He told her about the calls, about the notebook, about the news segments, about the fear that had been building for months, about seeing the car in the driveway and believing absolutely, with total conviction, that someone had come to harm him. He said, "I thought if I didn't act first, he'd get me before I could." He said it without theatrics, without self-pity, like a man reciting the instructions he had given himself, finally hearing how they sounded out loud. Orla found the notebook in Ellsworth's house during the search warrant. It was a standard composition book, the kind sold in every drugstore. On the front he had written, in his careful looping hand, "Things to know about scammers." Inside were pages of handwritten notes, facts he had gathered from news segments, from a library printout, from a pamphlet distributed by the county senior center. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was distorted in the way that isolated fear distorts things, exaggerated and reordered to confirm the worst. There was a page near the back that stopped Orla cold. It was headed, "What to do if they come to the house." Below it, in the same careful handwriting, were 5 bullet points. The last one read, "Do not wait. A man who hesitates gives the criminal the advantage." She photographed the page. She put the notebook in an evidence bag. She sat with it for a long moment before she moved on, because she understood, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that Ellsworth had not acted on impulse. He had, in his own terrible way, followed a plan. The district attorney's office was notified on Friday afternoon. The DA, a methodical man named Aldous Price, reviewed the case file over the weekend and announced on Monday that Ellsworth Calder would be charged with third-degree murder. The charge acknowledged that there had been no premeditation to kill Tomas specifically, but that the act had demonstrated a conscious disregard for human life. Yet the announcement was made at a press conference that was broadcast locally and picked up by 2 national news networks. Outside the police station, a small vigil had formed for Tomas, candles in paper cups, a photograph propped against the wall, his green jacket folded carefully on a wooden chair someone had brought from home. The image of that jacket became the image of the story. It appeared on every news broadcast. Valentina saw it on her phone and had to leave the room. Claudia Guerrero, watching from Harrisburg, placed her hand over the screen and wept. In the days following the shooting, 2 families sat inside their separate griefs like 2 people in adjacent rooms of the same burning house. The Guerrero family gathered in Harrisburg at Claudia's kitchen table. Here they cooked and ate and sat together in the way people do when tragedy arrives, not because food helps, but because the act of feeding each other is one of the few things left that makes sense. Ernesto, Tomas's father, had flown in from Guadalajara within 48 hours. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, with his son's dark eyes. He sat at the head of the table and did not speak much, but he kept his hand on Claudia's arm and did not move it. Valentina organized the funeral arrangements because she needed to move, needed to do something, needed to be useful in the face of something utterly useless. Little Marco did not fully understand what had gone wrong, only that Uncle Tomas was not coming and that everyone in the house was crying. Yet he took to climbing into Valentina's lap at unexpected moments and pressing his head against her chest and staying there, and she let him every time, no matter what she was doing. The Calder family was fragmenting. Gerald flew in from Portland and spent the first 2 days in a state of disbelief that kept folding into anger and back again. He had spoken to his father once since the shooting, a brief clipped call through the police station, and Ellsworth had said almost nothing. Gerald did not know how to feel about a father who had done something this catastrophic and could not seem to explain it in any terms Gerald recognized. He kept asking Petra, "Did you know he was like this? Did you know how scared he was?" And Petra kept saying, "I knew he was struggling, but I didn't know it was this bad." They were not quite fighting. But they were not quite supporting each other either. They were 2 people trying to process the same event from completely different angles, and the gap between the angles was enormous. Petra blamed herself. Gerald was not yet sure who to blame. The question sat between them like something neither one wanted to touch. Ellsworth was held on bail, set at $250,000. Gerald paid it, though he did so in a silence that was loaded with everything he hadn't said. When Ellsworth came home to the house on Heron's Crest Lane, it was Petra who was there to meet him. She had stayed on, taking emergency leave from work, because she could not bring herself to leave. She watched her grandfather come through the door, small in his gray cardigan, moving slowly. He had his eyes going immediately to the front porch where the forensics team had finished their work and scrubbed the boards clean. He stood in the doorway looking at the porch for a long moment. Then he went inside and sat in his recliner and said nothing for the rest of the evening. Petra made soup. She set it on the side table next to him. He did not eat it. She sat across from him and watched him stare at the wall, and she tried to understand how a man she had loved her whole life, a gentle man, a quiet man, a man who had never once raised his voice at her, how such a man had opened a door and fired a gun at a stranger. She did not understand it yet. She would spend months trying. What no one in either family knew at this point was that the full story of Ellsworth's mental state was considerably more complex than the police had yet established. His primary care physician, Dr. Hassani Obi, had seen Ellsworth 4 months before the shooting and had noted in his records what he described as increasing anxiety and evidence of persecutory ideation inconsistent with baseline. He had recommended that Ellsworth see a geriatric psychiatrist. He had mentioned this to Ellsworth at the appointment. Ellsworth had said, "I'll think about it." He had not gone. Dr. Obi had made a follow-up note in the chart flagging the issue for the next appointment, which was scheduled for the day after Tomas died, the appointment that Petra had booked the rideshare for. This information would come out during the trial. It would complicate everything. It would force both families, and the entire watching public, to sit with a question that had no clean answer. If Ellsworth had been suffering from a diagnosable psychiatric condition that no one had caught in time, who was responsible for what happened on that porch? The vigil for Tomas grew over the weekend. By Sunday evening, it had expanded to fill half the block outside the police station. People brought flowers, candles, photographs, and letters. Someone brought his 4.97 rating printed on a piece of paper and laminated. Someone else brought a rideshare company bumper sticker and wrote, "Rest easy," Tomas across it in marker. The CEO of the rideshare company issued a statement expressing condolences and announcing a fund for the Guerrero family. It raised $40,000 in 2 days. The green jacket sat in evidence at the police station, folded in a sealed bag. Valentina had been told she could have it back after the trial. She said she wanted it for Marco, when he was older, so he would know what his uncle was wearing when he went out to take care of them. She said, "I want him to know his uncle was working for us that night. That's the last thing he was doing." The trial of Ellsworth Calder began on a Tuesday in March, 4 months after the shooting. The courtroom in the Dunmore Falls County Courthouse was a high-ceilinged room with tall windows and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use. The gallery was full every day. On one side sat the Guerrero family, Claudia, Ernesto, Valentina, and 2 of Tomas's cousins who had driven in from Philadelphia. On the other side sat Gerald and Petra and 2 of Ellsworth's old neighbors from Heron's Crest Lane who had come because they felt they had to, even if they no longer knew what to feel. Ellsworth sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that Petra had bought for him. He was clean-shaven. He held his hands flat on the table in front of him, the way he had in the interrogation room, as if keeping them still was the one thing he could still control. He did not look toward the Guerrero family. He looked at the judge, or at the table, or at some middle point in between. The prosecution was led by a sharp, deliberate woman named Assistant D.A. Mireille Voss. She was known for her ability to make complex cases feel simple, to strip away the layers and leave the jury with a single, undeniable fact. Her opening statement lasted 18 minutes. She told the jury about Tomas. She described his career, his family, his 4.97 rating, his neatly coiled phone charger, the mints in his center console. She described the night he died step by step, minute by minute. She showed them a photograph of the porch. She showed them the trajectory of the bullet. She showed them Tomas's phone, still open on the rideshare app, showing the words, "Ride in progress." And then she said, Tomas Guerrero was not a scammer. He was not a threat. He was a young man who knocked on a door and said, "Your ride is here." And he was shot dead for it. The Commonwealth asks you to hold the man who pulled that trigger accountable for what he chose to do. The defense attorney was a veteran named Callaway Birch, silver-haired, methodical, 60 years old, with a reputation for taking hard cases and finding the human story inside them. His opening statement was quieter than Voss's, slower, built less around facts than around portrait. He did not dispute that Ellsworth had fired the gun. He did not dispute that Tomas had been innocent. He asked the jury to consider what it meant to be 83 years old, living alone, surrounded by silence and fear, bombarded with warnings about predators who targeted the elderly, convinced sincerely, completely, without any dishonesty that your life was in danger. And he said, Ellsworth Calder did not wake up on the morning of November 14th planning to hurt anyone. He woke up terrified. And he went to sleep that night having done something he will never, for a single moment of whatever life remains to him, stop regretting. He asked the jury to consider whether a man in the grip of genuine, diagnosable fear bore the same criminal responsibility as a man who had acted with clear, sane intent. He said, "This is not a simple case, but it is an important one." The first major witness was Dr. Hassani Obi. He testified for 3 hours. Under Voss's questioning, he confirmed that he had observed signs of deteriorating mental health in Ellsworth 4 months prior to the shooting. He confirmed that he had recommended psychiatric evaluation. He confirmed that Ellsworth had declined to follow up. When under Birch's cross-examination, he elaborated. The symptoms he had observed were consistent with late-onset anxiety disorder with paranoid features, possibly exacerbated by grief, social isolation, and media exposure. He said that this type of condition could, in susceptible individuals, create a mental state in which perceived threats felt absolutely real, even when they were not. He said carefully that he could not testify as to Ellsworth's state of mind on the night of the shooting, only that the groundwork had been laid for something like this to happen. Voss objected. The judge allowed it. The jury listened with the particular stillness of people taking something very seriously. The most shattering day of the first week was the day Detective Stem took the stand and read from the notebook. And she read the 5 bullet points from the page headed, "What to do if they come to the house." She read them in a flat, even voice, without editorializing. The last bullet. Do not wait. A man who hesitates gives the criminal the advantage fell on the courtroom like something physical. Claudia Guerrero closed her eyes. Ellsworth stared at the table. Petra pressed her hands together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles went white. Because the notebook made it undeniable. Ellsworth had not snapped in a moment of irrational panic. He had been building toward this. Quietly, methodically, in the solitude of his own home, he had been writing down reasons to pull the trigger before someone could pull one on him. And one night, those reasons had met an innocent man at the door. The second week of the trial belonged to the witnesses who knew Tomas. Yes, Valentina took the stand on Tuesday morning. She wore a black dress and kept her hands folded in her lap and answered every question in a voice so steady and controlled that several jurors later said it was the most composed they had ever seen a grieving person be. She described her brother. She described his laugh, his patience, his habit of humming while he cooked, his insistence on picking up the dinner check even when he was the one who could afford it least. She described the phone call she had made to him at 11:30 the night he died, the call he didn't answer. She described answering her door at 12:40 in the morning and seeing the officers standing there. She described having to explain to a 4-year-old boy over the following days that Uncle Tomas was with God. Yet she said it so quietly that the word God was barely a sound. When Mireille Voss asked if she had anything else she wanted to say, Valentina looked directly at the jury for the first time and said, "My brother did everything right. He followed every rule. He was a professional, and it wasn't enough. I need the jury to understand that it wasn't enough." Calloway Birch did not cross-examine Valentina extensively. He asked her 2 questions, gently. He asked whether she had ever met Ellsworth Calder before this trial. She said no. He asked whether she understood that Ellsworth had not known her brother. She paused for a long moment, then said, "I understand that he didn't know Tomas. That's the whole problem." Birch thanked her and sat down. Off the gallery was so quiet that the scratch of the stenographer's fingers on her keyboard was clearly audible. Claudia Guerrero was brought out of the courtroom by her husband after Valentina's testimony because she could no longer sit upright. Ernesto came back alone and sat in his usual place and folded his large hands on the bench rail in front of him and looked at the floor and did not move for the rest of the day. Ellsworth took the stand on Thursday of the 2nd week. It was the most anticipated moment of the trial. He walked to the witness stand slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man measuring each step. He adjusted the microphone. He folded his hands. He looked at no one in particular until his attorney asked the first question. And then he looked at Calloway Birch with an expression of a man who has decided to tell the truth regardless of what it costs him. He answered every question directly. He described Dorothea's death. He described loneliness. He described the calls, the news segments, and the notebook. He described standing at the window watching the car pull into the driveway and the specific flooding certainty that he had felt. The certainty that was so complete it had shut out everything else, every doubt, every other possibility. He said, "I was not in my right mind. I know that now. I was not in my right mind for a long time before that night. But I didn't know it then. I thought I was. I thought I was the clearest I'd ever been." Voss's cross-examination was precise and merciless, but not unkind. There was a distinction, and she knew how to maintain it. She asked Ellsworth whether he had looked through the peephole. He said no. She asked whether he had called out to the person before opening the door. He said no. She asked whether he had considered calling 911 before firing. He said no because he thought by then it would have been too late. She asked whether the rideshare notification had been on his phone that evening. He said he had seen it, but had not understood what it meant. He was still unfamiliar with the app. She said, "Mr. Calder, at no point between seeing that car and pulling the trigger did you give that young man one chance to explain who he was. Is that correct?" Ellsworth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That is correct, and I will carry that for the rest of my days." His voice did not break, but something behind his eyes did something that everyone in the room could see, even from a distance. The jury watched him with an intensity that was hard to name. Not quite sympathy, not quite condemnation. Something more complicated than either. Petra testified on Friday afternoon, the last witness of the week. She testified about booking the ride. She testified about the voice messages she had sent explaining the process. She testified about the August visit when she had noticed her grandfather's increased anxiety. She testified about the moment when she had realized, standing in the police station at 6 a.m, that the man who had died on her grandfather's porch had been there because she put him there. Her voice broke once, exactly once in the sentence. I was trying to help him get to his doctor's appointment safely. And she composed herself in 3 breaths, the way social workers are trained to do, and continued. When she left the stand, she walked back to her seat in the gallery and sat next to Gerald, and he took her hand without looking at her, and she did not pull it away. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of the 2 families sitting in separate rooms, drinking bad coffee from a machine in the hallway, watching the clock, trying not to imagine the different possible futures that waited on the other side of a single word. Valentina spent much of the deliberation period in the courthouse garden, a small, scrubby rectangle of grass and benches behind the building, sitting in the cold March air and talking to Tomas in her head. She told him about Marco. She told him Marco had learned to kick a soccer ball properly. Or she told him the $40,000 from the fund had covered the rent difference for a year. She told him she was trying. She asked him repeatedly what he would want and what the verdict he would want was, and she thought she knew the answer, though it was not as simple as she had expected when this began. She had come to this trial wanting justice in the shape of punishment. Somewhere along the way, watching an old man in a gray cardigan tell the absolute truth about his own unraveling, that shape had become harder to hold. The jury came back on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:15. The courtroom filled in 7 minutes. Both families took their places. Ellsworth sat at the defense table in his charcoal suit, hands flat on the table. The foreperson was a middle-aged woman named Sylvia, a retired teacher, and who stood to deliver the verdict with an expression that gave nothing away. The judge asked for the finding on the charge of third-degree murder. Sylvia looked at the paper in her hand. She looked up. She said, "Guilty." There was a sound in the courtroom that was not quite a sound, more of a collective held breath releasing all at once. Claudia Guerrero pressed her face into her husband's shoulder. Valentina sat completely still, looking at her hands. Petra made a small sound that was not a word. Ellsworth nodded once, slowly, as if he had been expecting it, as if it was the only verdict that made sense to him. His attorney placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. He did not flinch or react. He just kept his hands flat on the table and let what was coming come. The sentencing hearing was set for 6 weeks later. In the intervening period, something unexpected happened. Valentina Guerrero wrote a letter to the judge. It was 3 pages long, handwritten, and it was not what anyone had anticipated. She wrote about Tomas, what he had been, what he had meant to her, what Marco had lost. She did not minimize any of it. She wrote about watching the trial, about hearing Ellsworth's testimony, about hearing Dr. Obi describe a man who had been slowly dismantled by grief and fear and isolation until he was no longer fully the person he had been. She wrote, "I came to this trial wanting Ellsworth Calder to pay for what he took from us. I still believe he should be held accountable, but I have sat in that courtroom and I have seen a man who is already destroyed. He did not kill my brother out of hatred or greed or malice. He killed him out of fear, out of the worst. A most catastrophic kind of fear, the kind that comes when a person is left too alone for too long with nothing but their own terror for company." She asked the judge to consider, in sentencing, what justice truly meant in a case like this one for Tomas, for her family, and for the society that had failed to reach Ellsworth before it was too late. The letter became public when someone in the DA's office leaked it to a journalist. Within 48 hours, it had been read by millions of people. News programs dissected it. Social media fractured along predictable lines. Some people called Valentina a saint. Others called her naive. Others used her words as a springboard to argue about elder care, about gun control, about the way society abandoned its aging population. Valentina, watching all of this from her apartment in Harrisburg with Marco asleep on the couch, felt something she had not expected. Not regret about the letter, but an exhaustion so deep it went beyond tiredness into something structural, something geological. She had written the truth. She could not control what the world did with it. She turned off the news and sat in the quiet and listened to her son breathe. The sentencing hearing was the most painful day of the entire proceedings, not because of arguments or evidence, those were largely settled, but because of what happened in the final 10 minutes. After both attorneys had made their statements, after the judge had read Valentina's letter into the record, after the victim impact statements had been delivered and the formalities observed, the judge turned to Ellsworth and asked if he had anything to say before sentence was imposed. Ellsworth stood slowly, with the careful effort of a man whose joints ached and whose spirit ached worse. He turned, for the first time in the entire trial, to face the Guerrero family directly. He looked at Claudia and Ernesto. He looked at Valentina. He said nothing for a long moment, long enough that the judge was about to speak, and then he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried completely in the silent courtroom, "I cannot give you your son back. I cannot give you your brother back. I cannot undo any of it. All I can tell you is that there has not been a single moment since that night when I have not seen his face, and there won't be. For whatever time I have left." He sat back down. He put his hands flat on the table. Yet he did not look away from the Guerrero family until they looked away first. Judge Mariette Voss, no relation to the assistant DA, sentenced Ellsworth Calder to 7 years in prison, with eligibility for supervised release after 4 years given his age, health, and cooperation with the investigation. It was a sentence that satisfied no one completely, which is perhaps the closest the law can come to justice in a case where guilt and tragedy are so tightly wound together that separating them is impossible. The prosecutor called it appropriate. The defense called it severe for a man of 83. The Guerrero family said nothing publicly because they had said what they needed to say in Valentina's letter, and they had nothing left to perform for the cameras outside the courthouse. So they got into Ernesto's rented car and drove back to Harrisburg, and Claudia held Valentina's hand the whole way, and Marco fell asleep against Valentina's arm before they hit the highway. Ellsworth Calder reported to the Dunmore County Correctional Center on the 1st of May. He was the oldest inmate in the facility's recent history. He was assigned to the medical wing in recognition of his cardiac condition and his age. He did not complain about the conditions. He did not ask for special treatment. He read books from the facility library. He wrote letters to Petra, who wrote back every week without fail. He wrote one letter to Gerald, who did not respond for 3 months, and then sent a single postcard with 4 words. "I'm still here, Dad." And Ellsworth kept the postcard in his copy of a worn military history that had belonged to his own father. He looked at it sometimes in the evenings, in the way you look at something that is both a wound and a comfort. He did not stop seeing Tomas's face. He had told the courtroom he wouldn't, and it was the one promise, made to the people he had wronged, that he kept with absolute fidelity. Petra Calder went back to Columbus and to her job and to her life, but nothing was the same shape as before. She had always known, in the abstract professional way of a social worker, that the systems meant to care for aging, isolated people were inadequate. She knew the numbers, the rates of elder loneliness, the inadequacy of mental health resources for seniors, the way fear and isolation could compound into something clinical and dangerous. She had known it intellectually. Now she knew it the other way, in her chest, in her sleep, in the way she saw her grandfather's face every time she visited a client who was elderly and alone. She began, 6 months after the trial, to put together a proposal for a county-funded check-in program for isolated senior residents. It was not complicated. Regular home visits, phone check-ins, referrals to mental health services, a clear pathway to intervention when warning signs appeared. She called it the Heron's Crest Initiative, because she needed to give it a name that meant something real to her, even if no one else would ever know why. She presented it to the County Social Services Board in November one year, almost to the day, after her grandfather shot a young man on a porch in the dark. The board approved the funding. The first visits began in January. Valentina enrolled Marco in a youth soccer program the spring after the trial. He was 5 years old and played with the disorganized, joyful intensity of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious. She stood at the sideline on Saturday mornings with her coffee and watched him run and fall and get up and run again. And she thought about Tomas constantly during these moments, not with the sharp, suffocating grief of the early months, but with something softer and more enduring, a presence, an absence that had become a shape she had learned to live around. She put the green jacket in a cedar chest at the foot of Marco's bed, still folded, still in its evidence bag, waiting. She had decided she would give it to him when he was old enough to understand the full story of where his uncle went. She was not sure when that would be. She thought she would know when the time came. She thought Tomas would give her some kind of sign, a feeling, a moment of clarity, one of those small turns in the road that you only recognize as significant after you've already made it. The house on Heron's Crest Lane was sold by Gerald in June. At once the legal complications surrounding the estate were resolved. The new owners were a young couple who had moved from Philadelphia with a baby and a plan for a quieter life. They repainted the porch. They put in a new porch light, a bright one, motion-activated, the kind that trips on as soon as anything moves in the driveway. They planted a rosemary bush at the base of the steps, because the woman had read somewhere that rosemary was for remembrance, though she did not know the specific history of the steps above it. On the first warm evening of summer, they sat on the porch with the baby between them and watched the fireflies rise from the grass in the front yard, and they agreed, without knowing any of what had happened there, that it was a beautiful, peaceful place. Across town in the Dunmore Falls Cemetery, et on a headstone that had not yet been erected but was already ordered for when the time came, Claudia Guerrero had chosen the inscription herself. It read, "Tomas Guerrero. He went out to take care of us. He always did." There was a postscript that almost no one reported. 3 weeks after sentencing, Ellsworth Calder submitted a handwritten request through his attorney. He asked to make a financial contribution to a scholarship fund in Tomas Guerrero's name, money from the sale of some of his bonds, and the small amount from Dorothea's life insurance policy that he had never touched. The amount was $11,000. He did not announce it. He did not ask for recognition. His attorney submitted the paperwork and noted in the accompanying letter that his client wished the contribution to be anonymous and that it should be used, and if possible, to support young people pursuing careers in transportation, logistics, or community service. The Guerrero family was informed of the source. Valentina sat with it for a week before deciding what to do with it. In the end, she did not refuse it. She put it in an account in Marco's name. She told her mother, "It won't fix anything, but he knows that. That's why he did it." Claudia thought about that for a long time. Then she nodded, slowly, in the way she nodded when something was too complicated to agree with fully, but too true to disagree with either. The money sat in Marco's account. It would be there when he needed it. That was the only thing anyone could say for certain. The rest, the grief, the guilt, the slow, incomplete healing, the rest was still in progress, like a ride that has not quite reached its destination. Just like a life that keeps moving forward even when the road it travels has been broken by something that cannot be repaired, only witnessed and carried, and somehow, with great effort, with great cost, with no guarantees, survived.